such an incredibly complicated notion when you take the variety and the plurality of theory, that how could there be one, I mean, how do you imagine one document that would encompass such a vast area? How do you operationalize something like the people who believe that there's something more than interpretation, for example? All the interactive elements, and it just blows my mind. The idea that you obviously have a notion that could be encompassed, so I'm extremely interested.
Well, there is a book about that already. Balsam wrote a book 2 years ago called Psychoanalytic Technique Expanded, in which he actually goes through techniques with different types of disorders. It's not nearly as comprehensive as what you're suggesting, but it's a beginning, and he does list all these things. So there are some things out there that attempt to do
Yeah.
that.
The last one that I think of is like Grayson or something.
Yeah,
In the old days, when life used to be simple.
Right.
But this meaning has, Rosemary has gone over that structure. There is a structure in place to begin to feed these concepts back to the original theories and to get feedback across different perspectives. You have a great opportunity here to start creating operational definitions on one level for researchers and clinical data on another, or clinical definitions on another. And you can get agreement across regions the way these concepts were done.
What is interesting is that when you, let's say, have a book on techniques, because it does exist, right? But it usually is not operationalized. Usually it comes from one or maximum 2 points of view, basically, right? This is how Ralph Greenson would work, for instance. Or this is, when you have a transference-informed psychotherapy.
We have managed to. Took us years, but we have a manual of psychoanalytic psychotherapy specifically geared to severe personality disorders. That is, and that we work on. It is now the 3rd edition, and so we went in to look into psychoanalytic technique, and I have recently written a series of papers that's going to be published in a book, presenting an overview of psychoanalytic technique. What are the essential techniques, what are the secondary ones, and there is room for what is not interpretation, as well as for all clinical phenomena. Whatever happens while we see patients has to find a place. And as we define the basic concepts, we find out what doesn't fit and how it can be put in. We are not used to thinking that way. I'm aware of that. Manual sounds like a very rigid. What do you do now? But a contemporary concept of treatment manuals sees it as guiding principles that includes all the principles that then can be applied very flexibly and intuitively by the therapist, by the analyst, while outside observers can still tell whether the flexible way in which this is done fit within what the defined technique or not. That's what we need for research. And we may be really very well placed to do that.
Yeah. I am just as you were talking, just as you were discussing it, I am looking at the next concepts, right? So I said that there were several of the steps how we identify the concepts. Basically, we went down the line from the most frequently occurring everywhere, down the line. Then the second batch was conflict, object relations theories, and Nachdenklichkeit. That was the French had that, the concept. And the other regions had it enough frequently so that we then wrote on that. So those were the three, which is in our usually balance here, it would be the deferduction or afterwardsness in English. Now, and then each region again had their own specific, regionally specific, like we had self, intersubjectivity and ego psychology, and then the Latin Americas had transformations, maddening objects, which then got put under the object relations. But then there is the third group, and the third group is free association, building psychic structure, and that would be internalization, representation, symbolization. This is on your entries, okay, piece, which you all have.
That's what you sent us, right?
It is the interregional entries finalized. That's how it starts, okay? Did you distribute it? Yeah, okay. So now, on the new concepts, actually are very much in line with what you're talking about. Free association, building psychic structure, internalization, representation, symbolization, infantile sexuality, that's the French, and regression.
Yeah, regression would go in there, wouldn't it?
Regression is there.
Yes.
Yes, right. So what it appears again is that as we go down the line in terms of frequency, that very organically, while starting more with the, let's say, the metapsychology with the unconscious, but then already going towards more clinical concepts and clinical theories like transference, countertransference, and enactments, right? There we go for the also interactive, sometimes non-interpretive modes. And then we have ego psych, then we have intersubjectivity, again, more theoretical conceptualizations, and afterwards we go into all the kind of technical, basically not just the technique, but the way how all that comes up in real clinical interactive work, right? The interpsychic and interactive, how does that also interrelate? And you have it in the next 5 conceptual areas. And there already, I think we are basically going towards then how all that can start to be, it's already closer to the operationalization, right? How much with, let's say, certain diagnostic categories we would be using the free associations, how much they are really free, how much that becomes more loosened up thinking versus disorganized thinking, right? That would be a different way of, but certainly each school will again be informing as to how they are conceptualizing it and working with it. Under what conditions, when, with which patient. But I think that it is probably, you see, when we would start, just taking from dictionaries, I think, which is the terminology, we don't get the substantiation of the richness, which goes with the encyclopedic kind of global reach of that. But if it is coming out with the French participation, talking about French, if it is coming out of that whole fully informed, fully represented base, then we could find ways how it even for French will make sense. French, that's a very interesting, by the way, continent of thinking. It's its own universe. But also they are somewhat always interacting with the particular cultural milieu where the school of thought is developing, right? So in France, you have 1 or 2 actually camps, Lacanians versus never one-liners, which is Lagache versus Lacan. That was the beginning. But then you have Belgians, right, which certain concepts there which are akin to countertransferential enactments were not known because they were only published in French. Then that Jacobs and team wrote on enactment in the International Journal, a review, and then the Belgians got very offended, the French, how come we are not cited here? We are doing something very similar. Yeah, but because you didn't bother to come out with that, to let anybody know besides your kind of an isolated sphere. So now we are interconnecting, okay, we're translating things which were not translated from Spanish, from Portuguese, from French. And that's where you do get then some sort of a softer area of boundary, that it's not such a frontier, you know, there's no big wall sometimes. Once you start going more in depth how these people are thinking, because then it appears, well, yeah, this is really similar. And then they would write 40 pages on how they work with it, which already is just a step from operationalizing. Mm-hmm. You know, so they may not call it that. They may not say this would be a manual, but they are actually very close sometimes, approaching illustration. How does this come up in the session? And that is not so different. Although there will be big metaphysical, metapsychological words behind it, drives, for instance, right? So you will have a drive-informed enactment, yes, but it is still enactment. And then how do certain, let's say, interactive moments then emerge in this, and that would
different perspectives approach.
And that is finalized already very regionally, and you will see the differences. You know, when you look at the encyclopedia, then you will see the differences, but they are coming to the clinical process. Even from the most metapsychological, for instance, concept, well, you can take the unconscious or you can take Nachdeglichkeit, right? First of all, it was not possible to put together a European team. It was written by one person because the three of them got into quite a strife. So basically, it is only Chevret, right? Now, fortunately, we really, I told him, you will have to write about the others too. so it was included. But even with Nachdeglichkeit, if you look at it, you will have already, you have a taxonomy there. Now that comes from Apri, who is North American, Bionian, Freudian, putting that together. But it is a taxonomy, how you proceed, 10 steps of, and out of people, Volkan, intergenerational transmission, big concept, theory, right? Sounds esoteric many times, but there is a taxonomy. And then how does it emerge in the transference, countertransference, and how you interrogate it, how you approach it, how you work with it dynamically, analytically. So I think that is a very important issue, that ultimately that is where we are going, right? But the richness needs to be considered, and let's say we have to always stroke the French and say, of course that this is fully connected with the deepest strata of how we think about, how we conceptualize theoretically and meta-theoretically. But in fact, then when we are sitting with a patient in the office, there are certain processes which can be explicitly operationalized. how does that deeper strata come up, right? Or how does it emerge? And that already approaches operationalization. It may look differently than if there is an operationalization, let's say, of a particular behavioral concept or cognitive concept. But it will be possible, probably, to do operationalization.
It approaches it, and yet it keeps it within the metapsychological frame, rather than creating it sectionally as a technical methodology, which is, I think, really the important thing we can gain from this. It doesn't mean, and I'm talking to the research side of it, not the clinical side of it, because there needs to be a way to put together ideas that can develop reliability and validity coefficients. We need that. But it may not be enough to inform all our clinical work. So we need that as well. But I think the methodology issues are very important to have sectionalized. It's an opportunity.
Yes, and I think that this is actually what you are just bringing up, Art, is the maybe one of very core or essential than contributions of psychoanalysis to even the methodology of psychotherapy research or research on behavioral changes, right? Because for us, the latent and the metapsychological will emerge anyway somehow, but how do we capture it? How do we know it? How we interact with it? And how the effect maybe change, God forbid. Right? But the connection with the latent and how the latent then manifests itself, that could actually be part of that. Because we cannot lose the latent. Then of course we won't have French on board, but we will lose many people. Right?
90% of the room.
That's right, yes. But as long as the connection between the latent and manifest is preserved, it is doable. I would say, French of all, and I've met some rather creative French, so I am not, I see that more on a continuum. That, for instance, when they talk about symbolizations, if you take that as an example, so they are very much in camp of thinking something is not symbolized, but it is symbolizable. And I would use that almost as a hallmark of this kind of also approaching maybe we don't have that yet, but it may be doable if we actually get to think also of all that we are now gathering together as a reservoir for this kind of work, that this is where we may need to go also, without losing the richness and the connection with all the metapsychological thought and the deeper strata of
Could I just respond to that? Because I think while having as a goal being able to operationalize the concepts in the way that Otto suggests makes perfect sense, I think it would be a mistake to make that goal a limiting factor in the development of the concepts at the beginning. That is, to target it exclusively to operational would leave out very important dimensions.
Yes, no, that is so important. We don't have a goal, right? Because the goal, in a sense, is a process of seeing what exists in the world, in psychoanalysis thinking and work. But because we are also, the basic philosophy includes how the psychoanalysts think and work, there is a connection, right? And the work is somewhat informed then by something what we do. right? We think and we do, and the patient has a latent level of how they operate, and the manifest level, how it
To
comes.
go back to your French metaphor, they may not be defined reliably yet, but they may be definable. And if we can get near that, then we've done something very important.
Yeah, I'm not in any way against getting closer to reliability. I'm just saying that to use that to limit the collection, and let's also recognize that in any clinical practice in the medical field, there are dimensions to the efficacy of treatment that are not operationalized. When you choose a cardiologist, you don't only choose a cardiologist based on how well he follows the manual. Some are better than others in ways that are still not definable within a field like cardiology. So, I don't think we should assume that we should set for ourselves a too restrictive standard. That's all I'm saying. What you're pointing out, I completely agree.
I think we need to take that as an addendum, as an additional, very important aspect of the work. That becomes part of the thinking, how we are working on the concepts, or how, look, these concepts have been already gathered, right? What is coming now is just organically the next batch of concepts which are occurring most frequently on all continents. So we cannot shortchange that process. We are ultimately getting through the whole line of all the concepts which occurred at least once. Okay? Now, but if on someone's mind is also how effective this is, all right? That is also a thinking. This is how we think. This is somewhere in the back of our mind. This is part of what we do, right? And we may do that very naturally without even operationalizing it. We may be sitting there and the free associations are coming out, and we are making a decision, clinical decision, in interaction maybe between our pre-conscious unconscious with the patient's unconscious. What we are going
I
to
agree
find.
with you. I think that's incredibly important, and it introduces, we see us doing very exploratory work, really, about how all these different regions think, and it has been very surprising and enriching to interact with other people, the South American point of view that will sort of semi-agree and don't quite, but add yet another dimension that one hasn't maybe thought of before. So you're also bringing out and emphasizing that in order to do this kind of future work, that we might also keep in mind, as we can work with many different levels of integration in our own heads at the same time, that we have in mind, how do we work?
Yeah.
And that, I think we really I think this helps to sort of enrich, as you say, to have in mind as you're working on the other level of the exploratory level, to also keep track of if there are any comments from people about how do they do that work. The problem with that, is if you take it, or how seriously to take it in that direction, because inevitably, the obvious place to go if you're talking about clinical concepts is to go to clinical work. And, the introduction of too much clinical work in this kind of exploratory, conceptual exercise, it makes the thing gigantic too, It hasn't been one of the features of the materials that I've seen to date. There's very little in the way of clinical examples. there haven't been
Yeah.
so many
Yeah.
in the materials that I have seen, so I have to keep an eye out for that. But it just seems like it's extremely worthy and a direction, and I can see where the large geography of this world map can go. But as to our particular tasks at this particular time, when we're still sort of in a very, I think, in a very exploratory mode about how other regions are, how do we, I think that's a big discovery of this, that there are, in fact, connecting,
Yes.
sort of in this scaffolding, there are indeed connections that some of these schools of thought are not so radically different that we don't know what we're talking about. Sorry.
No, I'm resonating with what you're talking about, and as I am listening, I think the direction of the discussion on some level seems to be going from the specific to connection or generalizable mutuality or connection that exists regionally and interregionally and globally. And I think your work has been going that direction. Many specific culture or regions where certain concepts are utilized and understood, but similar kind of experience exists elsewhere, and somehow or the other, what seems to be kind of common thread seems to come at the end. As I was listening to Eva that was coming through, on the other hand, I think you, Dr. Kernberg, seem to be raising this issue of how we might be able to utilize something that's general or common to the specifics. And it might go from the specific clinician, the school they went, which school of thoughts and institute you are trained, regions, American psychoanalytic movement, or elsewhere. One movement goes back to more of an general. And what you seem to be talking about is, could we look at something that's kind of common and help the specifics? And somehow I think there's basic conflict or contradiction. I do think each one of us work with very specifics. Our clinical work has to be very specific individual, specific therapist, specific analyst with specific training, and so forth. And we are trying to find something that kind of touches us all. And in a way, we are searching for what we can claim together as psychoanalysts. And at the same time, there's this another way of organizing our own thoughts or a way of working that comes from general principle to the specific. So I think there's a kind of general conflict, or something needs to be looked at from both ends.
Well, it can be a very fruitful conflict.